I am Darlene Kovac, and I never thought the highway exit to my hometown would feel like driving toward a firing squad. 8 years in the Army teaches you to face danger head-on, but nothing prepares you for the churning in your gut when you're about to confront the family that wrote you off as a failure. The familiar skyline of Millbrook came into view as I gripped the steering wheel of my beat-up Honda, still wearing my dress uniform because, honestly, it was the only thing I owned that didn't have desert sand permanently embedded in the fabric. My phone had been buzzing for 3 days straight with messages from my mother, Maureen. Family dinner this Sunday, important announcement, be there. No warmth, no, we missed you, just the same commanding tone she'd used when I was 17 and stupid enough to think her approval mattered. The Kovac family had always operated like a military unit, except I was the only one who actually served. I never imagined my phone would ring at the perfect moment to change everything I thought I knew about my family. But before I tell you how this dinner turned into the biggest betrayal of my life, let me know where you're watching from and hit subscribe. You'll want to see how this ends. The Kovac construction empire had grown like wildfire while I was overseas. Billboards lined the interstate, featuring my older brother Preston's perfect smile, next to slogans about building America's future and veteran-owned, veteran-trusted. My younger sister Camille had apparently become the company's chief financial officer, her MBA from Wharton finally putting her business degree to use. Meanwhile, I'd spent the last 8 years defusing IEDs in Afghanistan and learning Arabic, skills that seemed laughably irrelevant in a world obsessed with profit margins and quarterly reports. The family compound hadn't changed much. Still the same sprawling colonial mansion that had intimidated me as a kid, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens that cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. 3 luxury cars sat in the circular driveway: Preston's black Mercedes, Camille's white BMW, and my father Eugene's vintage Jaguar. My Honda looked like a rust bucket by comparison, which was probably the point. I sat in the car for a full 5 minutes, staring at the house where I'd never quite belonged. Growing up, Preston was the golden boy destined to inherit the business. Camille was the brilliant daughter who could calculate profit margins in her sleep, and I was the stubborn rebel who insisted on playing soldier instead of contributing to the family legacy. When I enlisted right out of high school, my father had actually laughed. "When you're done with your little adventure," he'd said, "maybe you'll be ready to do real work." That was the last conversation we'd had before I left for basic training. 8 years of radio silence, broken only by the occasional birthday card from my mother, with a generic message and a check I never cashed. I'd sent letters during my first deployment, updates about my training, stories from the field, even a photo of me receiving a commendation for valor. Nothing. Not a single response. Preston's wedding invitation never came. Camille's graduation ceremony happened without me. Even my grandfather's funeral was something I learned about through social media, 3 weeks after the fact. But here I was, driving up their pristine driveway, because something in Maureen's voice had sounded different this time. Urgent. Almost desperate. She'd mentioned Preston's latest government contract, something about military housing projects worth hundreds of millions. She'd bragged about Camille's financial wizardry, how she'd navigated complex federal regulations to secure veteran preference certifications. The pride in her voice was the same as always, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded almost like fear. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. The uniform still fit perfectly, my ribbons and badges catching the afternoon light. Combat Infantry Badge, Bronze Star, Army Commendation Medal, 8 years of service reduced to colorful rectangles on my chest. At least they were real, unlike the carefully constructed image my family had apparently built while I was gone. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, my polished boots clicking against the marble steps. Whatever announcement awaited me inside, whatever reason they'd suddenly decided I was worth including, I had a feeling this dinner was going to change everything. I just had no idea how right I was. The doorbell echoed through the house like a death knell, and within seconds my mother appeared in the foyer wearing the same forced smile she'd perfected for charity galas. "Darlene, sweetheart, you look—" She paused, her eyes scanning my uniform with barely concealed distaste. Official. Even that single word transported me back to every family gathering I'd endured before enlisting. The memory hit me like a slap. My high school graduation party, where I'd announced my intention to join the Army. While neighbors congratulated me, my family had literally turned their backs and started discussing Preston's acceptance to Yale. "Darlene's going through a phase," my father had explained to confused guests. "She'll come around when she realizes there are easier ways to get attention." But the worst memory surfaced as Maureen led me through the familiar hallways lined with family photos. I stopped at the Wall of Fame, professional portraits and newspaper clippings celebrating every Kovac achievement. There was Preston at 19, shaking hands with the mayor after volunteering to build a veterans memorial, paid for entirely by the city, of course. Camille at 22 accepting an award for outstanding community service after organizing a charity drive that was really just a tax write-off for the company. Even my cousin Darren had a spot on the wall for completing a weekend military appreciation workshop. What wasn't there? My military academy acceptance letter that I'd been so proud to show them. My basic training graduation photo. The commendation I'd earned for saving 3 soldiers during a mortar attack. Not even the newspaper article about my unit's successful mission to protect a village school. Those achievements had been met with polite nods and immediate subject changes to Preston's latest business deal or Camille's semester abroad. The most painful memory crashed over me as we passed the living room where my siblings were waiting. 3 years ago, during my second deployment, I'd been awarded the Bronze Star for evacuating wounded civilians under enemy fire. I'd been so desperate for their approval that I'd actually called home from Afghanistan, using precious satellite time to share the news. Maureen had listened for exactly 30 seconds before interrupting. "That's nice, dear, but Preston just landed a contract to build the new courthouse. The whole town's talking about it." She'd hung up to help with the celebration, leaving me standing in the middle of a forward operating base, holding a dead phone and feeling more alone than I ever had in the desert. Meanwhile, Preston had been building his reputation as a military supporter without ever spending a day in uniform. I remembered watching news coverage of him speaking at veteran fundraisers, wearing expensive suits, and talking about honoring our brave men and women in service. The irony was suffocating. He was making millions off military contracts while I was actually serving, yet somehow he was the family's war hero. Camille hadn't been any better. She'd parlayed a summer internship at a Veterans Affairs office into a full career narrative about supporting our troops through financial services. Her MBA thesis had been about optimizing veteran benefits distribution, which sounded noble until you realized it was really about finding ways to process claims faster and cheaper. She'd never met a veteran who wasn't a potential networking opportunity or a bullet point on her resume. The photos on the wall told the story clearly. Preston cutting ribbons at military housing projects, Camille receiving awards from veteran organizations, both of them basking in reflected glory, while the actual veteran in the family was conspicuously absent from every frame. They'd built their careers on military credentials they'd never earned, while my real service was treated like an embarrassing hobby. "The children are so excited to see you," Maureen said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She'd always referred to Preston and Camille as the children, even though they were both adults. I'd never earned that designation. I was just Darlene, or your daughter, when she was forced to acknowledge me at all. As we approached the dining room, I could hear Preston's booming voice regaling someone with a story about military precision in construction management. The man who'd never woken up at 0500 for PT was lecturing about discipline and dedication. It would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. 8 years of watching my family profit from military associations while dismissing my actual service had hardened something inside me. But walking into that dining room, surrounded by their carefully crafted success built on borrowed valor, I realized I was about to discover just how deep their deception really went. The dining room fell silent when I entered, 3 pairs of eyes sizing me up like I was an unwelcome guest at my own family's table. But I'd learned something valuable during my years in military intelligence that my family never suspected: how to observe, gather information, and build airtight cases against people who thought they were untouchable. What they didn't know was that for the past 18 months, I'd been working as a civilian contractor for the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, investigating fraud in military construction contracts. My Arabic language skills and combat experience had made me invaluable for reviewing overseas projects, but my real expertise had become something entirely different: following money trails and identifying forged documentation in veteran-owned business certifications. The irony was devastating. While my family dismissed me as a failed soldier with no business sense, I'd been building the most important case of my career. It started when I noticed irregularities in veteran certification documents during a routine audit of Afghan reconstruction projects. Signatures that didn't match, service records that seemed too convenient, military honors that couldn't be verified through official channels. What began as a simple paperwork review had evolved into a massive investigation spanning dozens of companies across multiple states. My aha moment had come 6 months ago, while reviewing a stack of veteran-owned business applications in my cramped Arlington apartment. I developed a system for cross-referencing military service records with business certifications, and one company kept triggering red flags: Kovac Construction Enterprise. The name had felt familiar, but it took me 3 sleepless nights to realize why. My own family's business was claiming veteran-owned status based on military service that didn't exist. The struggle to investigate them without revealing my connection had been excruciating. Every document I uncovered felt like a personal betrayal. Preston's supposed Army service? Fabricated. His claimed Bronze Star? Purchased from a military surplus store. Camille's veteran affairs expertise? Built entirely on stolen valor and forged recommendations from officers who'd never heard of her. The deeper I dug, the more extensive their fraud became. They weren't just lying about military service. They were systematically defrauding the federal government out of millions in veteran preference contracts. Housing projects for military families, constructed with substandard materials while they pocketed the difference. School renovations on military bases, completed with unlicensed workers while they charged premium rates for certified specialists. My dining room table at home had become a war room covered with financial records, photographs, and testimonies from actual veterans who'd been denied contracts because companies like Kovac Construction were gaming the system. I'd spent countless nights cross-referencing their claims with real military databases, building an evidence trail that would make any prosecutor salivate. The most damning discovery had come 3 weeks ago. They were using my real military credentials without my knowledge. Someone had forged my signature on veteran certification documents, claiming I was a silent partner in the business to strengthen their veteran-owned status. My Bronze Star, my combat service, my years of sacrifice, all stolen to legitimize their criminal enterprise. But here's what made my investigation truly powerful. I wasn't working alone anymore. Through my Inspector General contacts, I'd connected with Sergeant Major Janet Reeves, a 25-year veteran who'd been tracking similar fraud cases nationwide. Together we'd built a network of real veterans who'd been screwed over by fake military contractors, creating an ironclad case that stretched far beyond just my family's crimes. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing suspicious payment patterns, testimony from subcontractors who'd been pressured to lie about veteran employment numbers, video footage of Preston speaking at military events while wearing medals he'd never earned, bank records showing massive federal payments for projects that were never completed to specification. 3 days ago, I'd submitted my final report to the Inspector General's office. 247 pages of documented fraud, supported by digital evidence that would hold up in any federal court. The recommendation was clear: immediate investigation, asset seizure, and criminal prosecution for mail fraud, wire fraud, and violations of the False Claims Act. What my family didn't realize as they sat there preparing to deliver whatever announcement had prompted this dinner invitation was that federal agents were already reviewing arrest warrants. The case I'd spent 18 months building was about to destroy everything they'd worked for, and they'd never see it coming. The sweet justice of it was almost overwhelming. While they'd been dismissing me as the family failure, I'd been systematically dismantling their criminal empire with the same precision I'd once used to dismantle explosive devices in Afghanistan. They thought they were about to announce something important to me. They had no idea I was about to announce something far more important to them. The formal dining room looked exactly like I remembered from childhood. Crystal chandelier casting shadows across the mahogany table, china place settings that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and an atmosphere so thick with tension you could cut it with the silver carving knife Eugene was ceremoniously sharpening. But something felt different. Desperate, almost. Sit, sit, Maureen gestured toward the chair at the far end of the table, the same spot I'd occupied as a kid when I was being lectured about my latest disappointment. Preston and Camille exchanged glances I couldn't quite read, but their smiles seemed forced, like actors who'd forgotten their lines. Preston had aged well. Success suited him. His hairline was receding slightly, but he wore it confidently, and his expensive suit couldn't hide the satisfaction radiating from every pore. "Darlene, you look," he paused, searching for words, "exactly like what I expected a career soldier would look like." Camille laughed, a tinkling sound that had always made my teeth ache. "What Preston means is you look strong. Very capable." Her diamond wedding ring caught the light as she gestured, and I noticed her nails were perfectly manicured. She'd clearly never worked with her hands a day in her life. "Thank you?" I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an observation. Eugene finally set down the carving knife and took his seat at the head of the table. Even at 68, he commanded attention, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing authority like a tailored jacket. "Before we eat, I think we should discuss why we're really here." My stomach tightened. Family dinners in the Kovac household had always been strategic affairs, but this felt more like a tribunal than a reunion. "The business has been thriving beyond our wildest expectations," Eugene continued, his voice carrying the same pride I remembered from childhood when he'd lecture about building something lasting. "Our military contracts alone have brought in over $400 million in the past 3 years. Preston's vision for veteran-focused construction has opened doors we never imagined." I kept my face neutral, but internally I was cataloging every word. 400 million matched the figures I'd uncovered in my investigation, money that should have gone to legitimate veteran-owned businesses instead of flowing into their pockets through fraudulent certifications. Camille leaned forward, her expression suddenly serious. "What Daddy's trying to say is that we've built something extraordinary. But success at this level comes with scrutiny. Government oversight, audits, investigations." She paused meaningfully. "Sometimes innocent businesses get caught up in witch hunts targeting veteran contractors." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't going where I'd expected. Preston cleared his throat. "The thing is, Darlene, we need family unity right now. The Inspector General's office has been sniffing around veteran-owned businesses, looking for any excuse to tear down successful companies. They're particularly targeting businesses with military connections." My blood turned to ice. They knew about the investigation. But how much did they know? And more importantly, did they know about my involvement? "What does this have to do with me?" I asked carefully. Eugene's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that's the beautiful part. Having a real veteran in the family, a decorated combat soldier with genuine credentials, strengthens our position immeasurably. Your military record, your security clearance, your access to Defense Department systems." "My what?" The words came out sharper than I intended. Maureen reached across the table to pat my hand with false maternal warmth. "Sweetheart, we know you've been working with government contractors since you left active duty. Your expertise in military protocols could be invaluable in helping us navigate these regulatory challenges." The room felt like it was closing in around me. They weren't just stealing valor, they were planning to implicate me in their crimes. My real military access, my legitimate security clearance, my actual government connections, they wanted to use all of it to legitimize their fraud and potentially make me complicit in their schemes. "We've prepared some documentation that would benefit from your review," Camille added, sliding a manila folder across the table. technical specifications, veteran certification renewals, compliance reports. Your signature on a few key documents would really help establish our credibility with federal auditors. I stared at the folder without touching it, my mind racing. They weren't just criminals, they were criminal masterminds planning to frame their own daughter for crimes they'd committed. The dinner invitation hadn't been about reconciliation or family unity. It had been about recruiting me as their unwitting accomplice, using my real military credentials to cover their fake ones. The irony was staggering. While I'd been building a case to expose their fraud, they'd been planning to frame me for it. I pushed the manila folder back toward Camille without opening it, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I'd like to understand exactly what you're asking me to sign before I commit to anything. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Preston's polished smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. Always the careful one, aren't you, Darlene? I suppose that's what 8 years of following orders will do to a person. Some might call it prudence, I replied evenly. Others might call it learning from experience. Eugene chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Experience. Yes, let's talk about that. What exactly have you accomplished since your little military adventure ended? Are you still living in that one-bedroom apartment in Arlington? Still driving that pathetic Honda we saw in the driveway? The attack was swift and practiced, designed to make me feel small and desperate enough to accept whatever they were offering. It was the same strategy they'd used my entire childhood. Highlight my failures, emphasize their success, then position themselves as generous benefactors willing to rescue me from my own inadequacy. Maureen joined the assault with practiced precision. We're not judging, sweetheart, but it must be difficult watching your contemporaries buy houses and start families while you're still finding yourself. Preston's youngest daughter just started private school, and Camille's building a vacation home in the Hamptons. Meanwhile, you're what, 36? Single? No children? No real career prospects? Each word was carefully chosen to wound. They'd clearly researched my life enough to know exactly where to apply pressure. What they didn't know was that my modest lifestyle was entirely by choice. Government work paid well enough, but I'd been banking most of my salary while building the case against them. Camille leaned back in her chair, studying me like a laboratory specimen. It's not too late, you know. Family businesses can be remarkably forgiving. We could create a position for you, something that leverages your military background while teaching you the fundamentals of real business. Real business, I repeated slowly, as opposed to what I've been doing? Preston laughed outright. Come on, Darlene, government work? Following bureaucratic procedures and filling out paperwork? That's not building anything. That's not creating value or generating wealth. You've spent your entire adult life in systems designed to limit initiative and reward conformity. The condescension was breathtaking, but I'd heard variations of this speech my entire life. Preston had always positioned himself as the visionary entrepreneur while dismissing my choices as safe, conventional, and ultimately meaningless. The fact that he was delivering this lecture while sitting on a fortune built through federal fraud made it even more surreal. Look around you, Eugene gestured broadly at the opulent dining room. This is what success looks like. This is what happens when someone has the vision to build something lasting instead of hiding behind a government paycheck and a uniform. Hiding? The word came out harder than I intended. Maureen quickly intervened with her trademark false concern. What your father means is that you've always been so risk-averse. Even as a child, you preferred rules and structure over creativity and innovation. The military was perfect for someone with your temperament. They were good at this, the systematic demolition of my self-worth disguised as family concern. Every career choice I'd made was reframed as evidence of my fundamental inadequacy. My military service became hiding from real responsibility. My government work became bureaucratic cowardice. My modest lifestyle became proof of failure. But what fascinated me was the desperation underlying their performance. They needed me to feel worthless enough to accept their offer, which meant they were in deeper trouble than they were letting on. The Inspector General investigation was closer than they wanted to admit, and they needed my legitimate credentials to legitimize their illegitimate business. Camille opened the manila folder and spread several documents across the table. These are just standard compliance forms. Veteran certification renewals, project oversight authorizations, technical specifications that require military expertise to validate. Your signature would simply confirm that our projects meet appropriate military standards. I scanned the documents quickly, my training allowing me to spot the key phrases that would make me legally liable for their fraud. Authorization of veteran-owned status, confirmation of military personnel involvement, validation of service records. Every signature would create a paper trail linking me to their crimes while providing them with plausible deniability. Take your time, Preston said magnanimously. We understand this is a big decision, but family has to stick together, especially when outside forces are trying to tear down everything we've built. They sat back, confident in their manipulation, waiting for me to capitulate to their superior wisdom and accept my role as their unwitting accomplice. They had no idea I was about to turn their entire world upside down. I pushed the documents back across the table, my decision made. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in signing anything without my attorney reviewing it first. The silence that followed was deafening. Preston's fork clattered against his plate as he set it down too hard. Camille's perfectly composed expression cracked just enough to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. Eugene's face darkened like a storm cloud rolling in. Your attorney? Maureen's laugh was brittle. Sweetheart, this is family business, we don't need lawyers between us. I always need lawyers between me and legal documents, I replied calmly. It's one of those habits you develop when you work with the federal government. Eugene leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used when I was 12 and had broken one of his antique vases. Darlene, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of this conversation. This isn't a negotiation. This is us offering you one final opportunity to be part of this family. And if I decline? The mask finally slipped completely. Camille reached into her briefcase and pulled out another folder, this one significantly thicker. Then we'll have no choice but to protect the family business from the criminal actions of a disgruntled former employee. My blood turned to ice as she spread new documents across the table. These weren't compliance forms. They were federal investigation reports, financial records, and what looked like sworn affidavits. At the center of it all was a document that made my heart stop. A veteran-owned business certification bearing my forged signature, dated 3 years ago. You see, Preston said with satisfaction, we've been using your military credentials to support our veteran-owned status since you've been back from Afghanistan. Perfectly legal, since your family and technically have been receiving compensation through trust fund distributions you never bothered to claim. I stared at the forged signature, my own name written in handwriting that was close enough to mine to fool a casual observer, but clearly fake to anyone who knew what to look for. You forged my signature on federal documents. We protected family interests, Eugene corrected. Unfortunately, it appears that you've been systematically embezzling funds from veteran preference contracts while using your security clearance to manipulate the bidding process. Quite an elaborate scheme, really. Camille slid another document toward me. A detailed financial report showing money transfers from Kovac construction accounts to a bank account I'd never seen before. An account that apparently bore my name and social security number. This account has been receiving regular deposits for 3 years, she explained with mock sadness. Deposits that correspond exactly with payments we received for military housing projects. It's almost like someone with inside knowledge of government contracting was skimming funds and covering their tracks through fraudulent documentation. The sophistication of the frame-up was staggering. They hadn't just stolen my identity for their veteran certifications. They'd created an entire alternate financial history that painted me as the mastermind behind their fraud. Every crime they'd committed had been carefully documented and attributed to me. Preston pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages. These are communications between you and several subcontractors, discussing payment schedules and project modifications. Very damning stuff, especially combined with your access to classified military facility information. The text messages were clearly fabricated, but they were good fakes. Someone had done their homework, creating a digital trail that would be difficult to disprove without extensive forensic investigation. They'd even included details about specific military projects that only someone with my level of clearance would know. The beautiful thing about this plan, Maureen said with false sympathy, is that it explains everything. Why you've been estranged from the family for 8 years. Guilt over stealing from the very veterans you claim to serve. Why you've been living so modestly despite your government salary. You've been hiding the stolen money. Why you suddenly wanted to reconnect with family. You needed our help to legitimize your continued access to military contracts. I felt the walls closing in around me. They'd spent years building this frame-up, creating layer upon layer of false evidence that would be incredibly difficult to refute. More importantly, they'd done it with the same attention to detail that had made their original fraud so successful. Eugene stood up, his full height imposing in the formal dining room. Here's what's going to happen, Darlene. Tomorrow morning, we're filing a complaint with the FBI detailing your systematic fraud against the federal government. We'll express our shock and horror at discovering that our own daughter has been using the family business to steal from military families. However, Camille added smoothly, if you sign those compliance documents tonight and agree to legitimize your ongoing involvement in our business operations, this unfortunate misunderstanding can be resolved privately. Family loyalty, you understand. The choice was stark. Become their willing accomplice or face federal prosecution for crimes they'd committed. They thought they held all the cards, believed their elaborate frame-up was foolproof. What they didn't know was that in 18 hours federal agents would be arresting them for the very crimes they were trying to pin on me. I stared at the fabricated evidence spread across the table, my mind racing through scenarios. They'd been planning this frame-up for years, building a case against me while I'd been unknowingly building one against them. The irony would have been funny if federal prison wasn't on the line. You have until tomorrow morning to decide, Eugene said, checking his Rolex with theatrical precision. 9 a.m. sharp. Either you sign those documents and become a legitimate partner in this business, or we hand over evidence of your criminal activities to the appropriate authorities. My phone buzzed against my hip, unknown number, but given the timing, it could only be one person. Excuse me, I said, standing from the table. I need to take this. Sit down, Preston ordered. Whatever it is can wait until we've finished discussing your future. I ignored him and answered the phone. Darlene Kovac. Sergeant Kovac? This is Special Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI. I'm calling to inform you that based on the evidence you submitted to the Inspector General's office, we've obtained federal warrants for the arrest of Eugene, Preston, and Camille Kovac on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, and violations of the False Claims Act. The room had gone completely silent. My family was watching me with confusion and growing alarm as Agent Torres continued. We're en route to the family residence now. Are you currently on the premises? Yes, I said calmly, meeting Eugene's increasingly panicked gaze. I'm having dinner with the subjects in question. Perfect. We'll be there in approximately 3 minutes. Please maintain your current position and do not alert the subjects to our presence. I hung up and placed the phone carefully on the table next to their forged documents. That was the FBI. The color drained from Camille's face. What did you just say? Special Agent Torres will be here in 3 minutes to arrest all of you for federal fraud. I sat back down and folded my hands in my lap. You might want to call your attorneys. Preston shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. You called the FBI on your own family? Actually, I submitted my evidence 18 months ago and have been building a case against you ever since. I gestured to their fake documents. Every crime you just tried to pin on me? I have documentation proving you committed it. Every forged signature, every fraudulent contract, every stolen dollar. All of it traced back to your accounts, your decisions, your criminal enterprise. Maureen's face had gone white as bone. You've been investigating us? Your own family? My family? I laughed, and it came out harsher than I intended. You just spent an hour trying to frame me for federal crimes. You forged my signature, stole my military credentials, and built an elaborate scheme to send me to prison for 20 years. That's not family, that's enemy action. Eugene was frantically gathering papers, his hands shaking as he tried to shove documents back into folders. This is insane. You can't prove anything. It's your word against ours. Actually, it's the word of 47 subcontractors you defrauded, 12 federal auditors who reviewed your fake certifications, and 16 actual veterans whose contracts you stole. I stood up as the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the driveway. Plus financial records, digital communications, video evidence of Preston wearing military honors he never earned, and testimony from Sergeant Major Reeves, who's been tracking veteran contractor fraud for 5 years. Camille was hyperventilating. The bank accounts, the evidence we showed you, will be excellent exhibits at your trial for attempted fraud and conspiracy. I straightened my uniform jacket as heavy footsteps approached the front door. You're not the only ones who can build a paper trail. The doorbell rang once, followed immediately by authoritative pounding. FBI, open up! Preston made a desperate lunge for the back door, but stopped when he saw federal agents already positioned in the backyard through the windows. Camille had collapsed into her chair, staring at the table full of documents that had just transformed from weapons into evidence of their own crimes. Eugene was the only one who maintained any composure, his businessman's instincts kicking in even as his world crumbled. How long? He asked quietly. How long have I been investigating you? Since I discovered you were using my name on federal documents. I stepped aside as Agent Torres and 3 other agents entered the dining room, weapons holstered but ready. How long have I been planning this moment? Since the day you told me real soldiers don't build anything lasting. Agent Torres held up her badge. Eugene Kovac, Preston Kovac, Camille Kovac, you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government. As the Miranda rights echoed through the dining room, where I'd been dismissed and belittled my entire life, I felt something I'd never experienced in this house before. Complete and utter satisfaction. Agent Torres moved with practiced efficiency, directing her team to secure the scene while reading each family member their rights. Preston was slumped against the wall, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face ashen. Camille sat frozen in her chair, mascara beginning to streak down her cheeks. But Eugene was staring at me with something that looked almost like respect. You orchestrated this entire dinner? He said quietly, as Agent Torres snapped handcuffs around his wrists. The timing, the evidence, everything. I learned from the best, I replied. You taught me that successful operations require careful planning, attention to detail, and the element of surprise. I just applied those lessons to something you never expected: justice. Agent Torres looked up from her paperwork. Sergeant Kovac, we'll need you to come in tomorrow to provide additional testimony, but your cooperation over the past 18 months has been exemplary. This case is going to shut down one of the largest veteran contractor fraud rings we've ever prosecuted. Preston suddenly found his voice, rage replacing shock. You destroyed your own family. For what? Some misguided sense of duty to strangers who'll never appreciate what you've done? I turned to face him fully, letting him see the steel in my eyes that 8 years of military service had forged. I didn't destroy this family, Preston. You did that when you decided to build your empire on stolen valor and fraudulent contracts. I just documented the destruction you'd already caused. But the money, Camille started, will be returned to the veterans and military families you stole it from, I interrupted. Every dollar you skimmed from housing projects? Well, every penny you earned through fake certifications, all of it is going back to people who actually served this country. Maureen, who had been silent since the arrests began, finally spoke. You could have been part of something great. We offered you everything: money, status, a place in the family business. You offered me a place in a criminal enterprise built on dishonoring everything I've ever fought for. I walked to the wall of family photos, stopping in front of Preston's fake military memorial dedication ceremony. This photo shows him wearing a bronze star he bought online. That ceremony honored veterans who died serving their country, and he used their sacrifice to legitimize his fraud. I moved to another photo, Camille at a veteran fundraiser shaking hands with a Gold Star mother. This woman lost her son in Afghanistan. Camille used that photo in marketing materials to win contracts meant for veteran-owned businesses. She literally profited from that mother's grief. Agent Torres was carefully documenting each piece of evidence on the table, photographing the forged signatures and fraudulent bank records. These documents alone constitute multiple felony counts, she told my family, but they're just the tip of the iceberg compared to what Sergeant Kovac has provided us. I pulled out my own phone and opened a folder containing hundreds of photographs. 18 months of documentation. Every forged document, every fake certificate, every fraudulent claim you've made. I photographed Preston's military surplus medals, recorded Camille's lies about veteran employment numbers, documented every subcontractor you pressured into falsifying reports. Eugene's composure finally cracked. We're your family, your own flesh and blood. My family, I said slowly, consists of the men and women who bled with me in Afghanistan, the veterans who trusted me to expose the fraud that was stealing their opportunities, the federal agents who worked with me for 18 months to build this case. You're just criminals who happen to share my DNA. Preston made one last desperate attempt. You think you've won something here? You've destroyed a $400 million business. Hundreds of employees will lose their jobs because of your self-righteous crusade. Those employees will find work with legitimate contractors who don't build their success on stolen valor, I replied calmly. And those $400 million? That was never your money to begin with. You stole it from veterans, and now it's going back to them. As Agent Torres and her team prepared to escort my family to federal holding, I walked to the dining room table one last time. The manila folder they'd tried to use to frame me was still sitting there, next to the fabricated evidence of my supposed crimes. You made one critical mistake, I told them as they were led toward the door. You assumed that because I was the family outcast, I must be weak and desperate for your approval. You never considered that being rejected by criminals might actually be a badge of honor. I picked up the folder containing their forged documents and handed it to Agent Torres. Everything you need to prove conspiracy and premeditation is right here. They weren't just committing fraud, they were actively trying to frame me for. Eugene paused in the doorway, flanked by federal agents, but still trying to maintain some shred of dignity. This won't bring you peace, Darlene. Destroying us won't fill the hole in your life. I looked around the opulent dining room one last time, the crystal chandelier, the expensive artwork, the wall of fake achievements built on real suffering. You're wrong about that. Exposing you is the most meaningful thing I've ever done. Every veteran who gets a fair shot at a contract, every military family who receives the quality housing they deserve, every dollar that goes to legitimate service providers instead of fraudulent. That's going to bring me more peace than I've ever felt in this house. As the front door closed behind them, I stood alone in the silence of their collapsed empire, finally free from the weight of their expectations and disappointment. The house felt different now. Smaller, less intimidating, just an empty building where criminals used to live. 20 minutes later, I sat in my Honda in the driveway of a modest duplex across town, staring at the warm yellow light spilling from the windows. Through the glass, I could see Janet Reeves moving around her kitchen, probably making her famous coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. After 18 months of working together to build the case against my family, Janet had become more than a colleague. She'd become the sister I'd never had. I knocked on her door, still wearing my dress uniform, and she opened it before the sound stopped echoing. "Well?" she asked, studying my face. "It's done. They're all in federal custody." Janet's weathered face broke into a grin that could have powered the entire neighborhood. "Get in here, soldier. We're celebrating." Her living room was the antithesis of my family's mansion. Mismatched furniture, walls covered with genuine military photos, and a coffee table held together with duct tape and determination. But it felt more like home than the Kovac estate ever had. Sergeant Major Janet Reeves had served 3 tours in Iraq, earned her stripes the hard way, and dedicated her retirement to protecting veterans from the exact kind of fraud my family had been perpetrating. "Marcus, Tommy, "Get out here," Janet called toward the back of the house. "Our girl just took down the biggest fraud case in 5 years." Marcus Webb emerged from the kitchen carrying a bottle of bourbon and 3 glasses. The former Marine had lost his left leg to an IED in Fallujah, but he moved with the same confident bearing that had made him a natural leader. Behind him came Tommy Hernandez, a Navy veteran whose quiet intensity masked one of the sharpest investigative minds I'd ever encountered. To Darlene Kovac, Marcus raised his glass, who proved that family loyalty means protecting the people who earned it, not the people who demand it. We drank, and the bourbon burned away the last residue of that poisonous dinner. These 3 veterans had been my real family for the past year and a half, working nights and weekends to help me build an airtight case. While my biological relatives were planning to frame me for federal crimes, my chosen family was helping me expose those very crimes. "Tell us everything," Tommy said, settling into his favorite chair. "How did they react when Taurus showed up?" I recounted the entire evening, the attempted manipulation, the forged documents, the elaborate frame-up, and the moment their world collapsed around them. With each detail I felt lighter, like I was shedding years of accumulated shame and disappointment. The look on Preston's face when he realized I'd been investigating them, I laughed, and it felt good to laugh about it. He actually asked how I could destroy my own family, as if stealing from veterans wasn't destroying anything that mattered. Janet shook her head in disgust. $400 million stolen from legitimate veteran contractors. Do you know how many businesses like Tommy's lost out on work because of those fraudulent certifications? Tommy nodded grimly. His small electrical contracting company had been shut out of dozens of military projects over the years, unable to compete with larger firms that were gaming the veteran preference system. Every fake veteran-owned business that got preferential treatment meant a real veteran didn't get that opportunity. Your family wasn't just stealing money, they were stealing dreams. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "With the business, the assets, all of it?" "Complete forfeiture," I replied. "Every dollar they earn through fraudulent contracts gets returned to the federal government for redistribution to legitimate veteran contractors. The houses, the cars, the company, all of it gets liquidated. Preston and Camille's kids will be fine. They have trust funds that weren't connected to the fraud, but the empire my family built? It's gone." Janet refilled our glasses. "Good. Let it be a warning to every other fake veteran contractor out there. We've got investigators tracking similar schemes in 12 other states now, all based on the patterns you helped us identify." The conversation turned to the broader investigation, the other cases we'd helped build, the real veterans who would finally get fair consideration for military contracts. But what struck me most was the warmth in this room, the easy camaraderie of people who'd actually served together, even though our service had been in different branches at different times. Marcus had been there when I'd discovered the forged signature on my family's documents, talking me through the rage and betrayal. Tommy had spent countless hours teaching me advanced financial analysis techniques to trace their money laundering. Janet had provided the credibility and connections that turned my personal vendetta into a federal investigation. "You know what the best part is?" Janet said, reading my thoughts with the intuition that came from shared experience. "Tomorrow morning, when your family wakes up in federal holding, they'll finally understand what real military precision looks like. No wasted effort, no collateral damage, just a perfectly executed mission that accomplished exactly what it was designed to do." In this modest living room, surrounded by real veterans who'd earned their decorations through blood and sacrifice, I finally understood the difference between family you're born into and family you choose. The weeks following the arrests passed in a blur of depositions, media interviews, and legal proceedings that felt surreal after 8 years of military routine. I'd testified before federal grand juries, provided evidence to congressional investigators, and somehow become the public face of veteran contractor fraud reform. But the most satisfying moments were the quiet ones, helping real veterans navigate the newly available contract opportunities that my family's prosecution had opened up. My phone had been ringing constantly since news of the arrests broke. Reporters wanting the family betrayal angle, prosecutors needing additional testimony, and veteran advocacy groups offering job opportunities I'd never imagined. But the calls I ignored completely were the ones from Millbrook County Jail. Preston had tried first, 3 days after his arrest. The automated system announced, "You have a collect call from an inmate at Millbrook County Jail," before I hung up without listening to the name. Camille tried next, then Maureen, then Eugene. Each time I disconnected the moment I heard collect call. My mother had somehow gotten my Arlington apartment address and sent a 6-page, handwritten letter that I threw away unopened. Preston's wife had shown up at my office building, demanding to speak with me about what this was doing to the children. I'd asked building security to escort her out and add her name to the banned visitors list. The boundary setting wasn't just emotional, it was practical survival. Federal prosecutors had made it clear that any contact with my family during the ongoing investigation could compromise the case. More importantly, I'd learned that their manipulation had been so systematic and long-term that even brief contact triggered old patterns of self-doubt and emotional turmoil. Janet had been instrumental in helping me understand the psychology of cutting ties with toxic family members. "It's not about revenge," she'd explained during one of our evening strategy sessions. "It's about protecting the mission. Your mission now is helping veterans, and that mission is incompatible with people who steal from veterans." The mission had become all-consuming in the best possible way. Working with Tommy and Marcus, I'd helped establish the Veterans Contractor Integrity Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to investigating fraud and supporting legitimate veteran-owned businesses. My Inspector General connections had opened doors to federal funding, and my experience with the Kovac case had provided a blueprint for identifying similar fraud schemes. We'd already helped expose 3 other fake veteran contractors in different states, leading to additional federal prosecutions and the recovery of over $60 million in fraudulent payments. More importantly, we'd helped dozens of legitimate veteran businesses win contracts they'd been unfairly denied for years. The most rewarding case had been Marcus's own company. His small construction firm had been repeatedly outbid by larger companies with questionable veteran credentials. Using the investigative techniques I'd developed during the Kovac investigation, we'd proven that his biggest competitor had been falsifying veteran employment numbers and inflating their service records. Within 6 months, Marcus had won 3 major military housing contracts that would employ 12 other veterans. "You've given me my business back," he'd said after signing the first contract. "More than that, you've given me faith that the system can actually work when criminals aren't gaming it." My own career had taken an unexpected turn. The Department of Defense had offered me a permanent position as a senior investigator with the Inspector General's office, specifically focusing on contractor fraud. The work combined my military background, my investigative skills, and my passion for veteran advocacy in ways I'd never imagined possible. But the real transformation was internal. For 36 years, I'd measured my worth against my family's expectations, always falling short of their arbitrary standards for success. Now I woke up every morning knowing that my work was protecting the men and women who'd served alongside me, ensuring that their sacrifices weren't exploited by criminals wearing borrowed valor. The contrast was stark and liberating. Instead of attending family dinners where my achievements were dismissed, I spent evenings with fellow veterans, planning investigations that would help thousands of service members. Instead of enduring lectures about my life choices, I received calls from veterans whose businesses were thriving because we'd leveled the playing field. My apartment had been transformed into a command center filled with case files, financial records, and photos of the veterans we'd helped. The wall that had once displayed my lonely military commendations now featured thank you letters from veteran contractors, news articles about successful prosecutions, and group photos from Veterans Contractor Integrity Project. The final boundary I'd established was the most important. I stopped checking news coverage of my family's legal proceedings. Their sentencing hearings, their appeals, their attempts to minimize their crimes. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that their criminal enterprise was dismantled and could never again steal opportunities from veterans. Eugene, Preston, and Camille had become what they'd always accused me of being, irrelevant to anything that actually mattered. 6 months after the convictions were finalized, I stood in the main conference room of the Veterans Contractor Integrity Project's new headquarters in downtown D.C., watching Janet hang a brass nameplate on the door that read, "The Kovac Center for Military Contractor Ethics." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. My family's name, once synonymous with fraud and stolen valor, was now permanently associated with protecting veterans from the exact crimes they'd committed. "You sure about this?" Janet asked, stepping back to admire the nameplate. "Using your family name for something this visible?" "That's exactly why I want to use it," I replied, straightening my civilian blazer. After months of testifying in military dress uniform, I'd finally transitioned to business attire that felt more appropriate for my new role as Executive Director of Veterans Contractor Advocacy. Eugene spent 40 years building the Kovac name into something that represented fraud and exploitation. I'm going to spend the next 40 rebuilding it into something that represents integrity and justice. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been deliberate. Every decision I'd made since the arrests had been designed to reclaim my family's legacy and redirect it toward protecting the veterans they'd victimized. The $47 million in recovered assets from their fraud prosecution had been partially allocated to funding our nonprofit work, creating a perfect circle of justice that turned their stolen money into veteran protection services. Tommy walked into the conference room carrying a stack of new case files. "We just got referrals from 3 different states, all potential contractor fraud schemes that follow the same pattern you identified with your family's operation." He set the files on the conference table with satisfaction. The Kovac method is becoming the gold standard for investigating fake veteran businesses. The Kovac method, our systematic approach to identifying fraudulent veteran contractors, had been refined over months of successful investigations. It combined financial analysis, military record verification, and on-site inspection techniques that could expose fake veteran-owned businesses within weeks instead of years. Federal agencies across the country were now using our protocols to screen contractor applications and investigate suspicious claims. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw the news article about your nonprofit. Dad would be proud." It was signed Preston. I deleted the message without responding. Eugene, Preston, and Camille were serving federal sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, but they were no longer part of my story. The Kovac legacy belonged to me now, and I was writing it in service to veterans rather than in service to greed. Janet appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of her infamous coffee. "Thinking about legacy? Building one," I corrected, accepting the coffee and savoring its familiar burn. One case at a time, one veteran at a time, one stolen opportunity restored at a time. Through the window, I could see the eternal flame at Arlington National Cemetery flickering in the distance, a reminder of the sacrifice that gave meaning to everything we did. My family had profited from that sacrifice. Now I was protecting it. 2 years after that first dinner invitation that changed everything, I found myself standing in the same spot where I'd once parked my beat-up Honda, staring at the Kovac family estate. But this time, I wasn't the prodigal daughter returning home in shame. I was the federal contractor who'd purchased the property at government auction, preparing to transform it into a residential training facility for veteran entrepreneurs. The house looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of its intimidating grandeur by the reality of what it had always been, just a building where criminals had lived. The crystal chandelier was gone, sold to help compensate the veterans my family had defrauded. The expensive artwork had been auctioned off, with proceeds going to the Veterans Contractor Integrity Project. Even the perfectly manicured gardens had been allowed to grow wild, nature slowly reclaiming what had been artificially maintained through stolen money. Janet stood beside me reviewing architectural plans for the conversion. 36 residential units for veteran entrepreneurs, plus common areas for business development workshops and mentoring programs. "It's going to be beautiful." "It's going to be useful," I corrected, which was more important than beautiful. Everything my family built here was about appearance and status. This will be about function and service. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. The house where I'd been dismissed as a failure was being converted into a place where veterans could develop the business skills they needed to compete fairly for federal contracts. The dining room where my family had tried to frame me for their crimes would become a conference center where we'd teach other veterans how to protect themselves from similar fraud schemes. But the real transformation hadn't happened to the building. It had happened to me. For 36 years, I'd carried the weight of my family's disappointment, measuring my worth against their arbitrary standards and always finding myself lacking. The military had given me confidence and skills, but it hadn't healed the fundamental wound of never being good enough for the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. It wasn't until I destroyed their criminal empire that I finally understood the truth. Their approval had never been worth seeking. Eugene, Preston, and Camille were criminals who'd built their success on exploiting the sacrifice of better people. Their disappointment in me wasn't evidence of my failure, it was evidence of my integrity. The phone in my pocket buzzed with a text from Marcus. Sarah Chen just got another contract, $18 million cybersecurity deal with the Navy. Says she couldn't have done it without the confidence our program gave her. I smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that came with helping veterans succeed through their own merit rather than through corruption. That was my true family now. The growing network of veterans whose businesses were thriving because they had fair access to the opportunities they'd earned. Every successful contract award, every fraud scheme we exposed, every legitimate veteran business we helped establish felt like a victory not just for them, but for everyone who'd ever been told they weren't good enough by people who weren't qualified to judge. Tommy emerged from the house carrying a clipboard full of contractor estimates. The renovation will take 8 months, but we can start the first entrepreneur residency program by next spring. We've already got 47 applications. I looked up at the windows of what had been my childhood bedroom, where I'd spent countless nights feeling like an outsider in my own family. Soon those rooms would house veterans who were building legitimate businesses, creating real value, contributing to their communities through honest work rather than elaborate fraud. The circle was complete. The house that had represented everything I could never be was becoming a place where other veterans could become everything they were capable of being. My family's legacy of deception was being replaced with a legacy of integrity, one successful veteran entrepreneur at a time. As we drove away from the estate for the last time, I felt something I'd never experienced there before: complete and utter peace. Not the peace of reconciliation or forgiveness, but the peace of knowing that my worth had never depended on their approval and never would again. I was Darlene Kovac, defender of veterans, exposer of fraud, and creator of opportunities for people who'd earned them through service rather than deception. That was enough. That was everything. Have you ever felt trapped by your family's expectations, constantly fighting for approval from people who seemed determined to withhold it? Maybe you've experienced the painful realization that the people who should support you are actually holding you back. Or maybe you've discovered that your biological family and your chosen family are completely different groups of. My journey from family disappointment to federal prosecutor taught me that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty isn't protecting the people who share your DNA, it's protecting the values and principles that define who you really are. When my family tried to frame me for crimes they'd committed, they forced me to choose between family loyalty and moral integrity. Choosing integrity didn't just save my career, it saved my soul. The Veterans Contractor Integrity Project now helps over 200 veteran businesses annually, and we've recovered more than $300 million in fraudulent contracts. But the real victory isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in the peace that comes from knowing your life has meaning beyond seeking approval from people who were never worthy of giving it. I'd love to hear your story. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Have you found your chosen family among people who share your values rather than your blood? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else find the courage to define success on their own terms. If my journey resonated with you, Please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to define success on their own terms. Sometimes the family that truly matters is the one you build through shared purpose and mutual respect. Remember, your worth isn't determined by people who can't see your value. It's determined by the impact you make on people who do.